This is the story of a British soldier who did something that would seem unthinkable in the midst of war, something that defied every rule, every expectation, and every boundary that conflict creates between people. In 1945, as Europe lay in ruins and millions were trying to piece their lives back together, one man made a choice that would change two lives forever. He looked at a child, an enemy child according to the laws of war, and saw not a German, not a symbol of the regime that had torn the world apart, but simply a boy who needed help. What he did next would become one of the most touching and controversial acts of compassion to emerge from the Second World War. The year was 1945, and Sergeant Charles Coward of the British Army found himself in a position that thousands of Allied soldiers shared, standing amid the wreckage of Nazi Germany as the war drew to its bloody conclusion. But Charles wasn't like other soldiers. Throughout the war, he had already gained a reputation, not for brutality or tactical brilliance, but for something else entirely. He was known as a man who couldn't turn away from suffering, regardless of whose side that suffering occurred on. As British forces pushed deeper into German territory, they encountered countless displaced people, refugees, survivors of concentration camps, and among them, children. So many children. Some had lost their parents to the bombings, others to the camps, and some simply found themselves alone in a world that had been turned upside down. In the small German town of Freising, just north of Munich, Charles encountered a boy named Heinz. The child was roughly 7 years old, though malnutrition had made him appear younger. His clothes were little more than rags, and his eyes carried a hollowness that no child's eyes should ever hold. Heinz's story was tragically common for the time. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front, his mother had died during an Allied bombing raid, and he had been surviving on the streets, scavenging for food, sleeping in abandoned buildings, moving from one ruined structure to another like a ghost, haunting the remains of the Third Reich. Most soldiers would have reported the child to the military authorities, who would have placed him in one of the many overwhelmed orphanages or refugee centers that dotted the occupied zones. That would have been the proper procedure, the expected action, the safe choice. Charles Coward did not make the safe choice. Over the following days, he began bringing food to the boy, sitting with him, trying to communicate despite the language barrier. Heinz was terrified at first, understandably so. He had been taught that British soldiers were the enemy, and here was one offering him bread, chocolate, kindness. But hunger and loneliness are powerful forces, and slowly the boy began to trust this foreign soldier who smiled at him and ruffled his hair, and seemed to genuinely care whether he lived or died. Charles learned fragments of Heinz's story through gestures, through the few German words he had picked up during the war, and through the universal language of a child's tears when he spoke of his mother. What happened next was unprecedented. Charles Coward made the decision to essentially adopt Heinz, not officially, not through any legal channels, but through an act of pure human compassion that flew in the face of military regulations, international law, and the bitter hatred that still poisoned the air between British and Germans. He began taking the boy with him, keeping him close, protecting him. His fellow soldiers noticed, of course. Some were supportive, understanding that war had orphaned countless children and that someone had to help. Others were deeply uncomfortable, even hostile. This was a German child, they reminded Charles, the son of a Nazi soldier. How could he justify caring for this boy when British children back home had also suffered, had also lost parents to German bombs? Charles's response was simple and profound. He said the boy was just a child, that he hadn't chosen his nationality or his parents, and that he deserved a chance at life, just like any other child. In a world that had become consumed by categorizing people, by deciding who deserved compassion based on which side of a line they had been born on, Charles chose to see only a vulnerable human being who needed help. But keeping Heinz with him was just the beginning of the challenge. The British Army had strict protocols about fraternization with German civilians, and the idea of a soldier essentially adopting an enemy child was so far outside standard procedure that there was no protocol for it at all. Charles had to be clever. He dressed Heinz in makeshift British uniform pieces, small enough to fit the boy, and told anyone who asked that he was helping to look after a refugee child temporarily until proper arrangements could be made. He shared his rations with Heinz, taught him basic English words, and slowly, day by day, the traumatized little boy began to show signs of life again. He smiled occasionally, played with small toys that Charles or other sympathetic soldiers scrounged up for him, and began to put on weight. The transformation was remarkable, but it couldn't last in its current form. The war was ending, occupation zones were being formalized, and military units were being reorganized and sent home. Charles faced an impossible question. What would happen to Heinz? The regulations were clear. German children were to remain in Germany, cared for by German authorities or international relief organizations. British soldiers were to return to Britain, to their families, to their lives. There was no provision for bringing home a German child, especially not informally, especially not one whose adoption had never been legally processed. Charles knew that if he left Heinz behind in an orphanage, the boy would become just another number, another war orphan in a system that was buckling under the weight of millions of displaced people. The chances of Heinz receiving individual attention, proper care, or any real opportunity for a good life were slim. The orphanages were overcrowded, undersupplied, and staffed by people who were often as traumatized as the children they were meant to care for. So Charles made another impossible decision. He would find a way to bring Heinz to England. The logistics were staggering. He needed documentation that didn't exist, approvals that would never be granted through official channels, and a way to transport a German child through military checkpoints, across occupied zones, and eventually to Britain without being stopped and without Heinz being taken away. He began working with a small network of sympathetic soldiers and officers, people who had also seen too much suffering and were willing to bend rules to help one child. They forged documents, claiming Heinz was a displaced Belgian child, betting that the chaos of post-war Europe would prevent anyone from looking too closely at paperwork. The journey was harrowing. Charles had to move Heinz through checkpoints where one suspicious officer could have ended everything, where the wrong question could have exposed their deception. There were moments when it seemed impossible, when Charles wondered if he was putting both himself and the boy at terrible risk for a dream that could never work. But at each checkpoint, the papers passed inspection, or the officers were too tired and overwhelmed to scrutinize them closely, or simple human decency made them look the other way when they sensed what was really happening. Slowly, impossibly, they made progress. From Germany to France, from France to the Channel crossing, and finally, in late 1945, they arrived in England. Charles Coward lived in a small town in Berkshire, and when he arrived home with a young German boy in tow, the reaction was mixed, to put it mildly. Britain had been bombed for years, had lost hundreds of thousands of its citizens to the war, and the wounds were still fresh. For many people, the idea of a British soldier bringing home a German child was shocking, even offensive. Charles's own family was divided. Some members welcomed Heinz, understanding Charles's compassion and recognizing that the boy was innocent. Others struggled with the idea, seeing Heinz as a representative of the enemy that had caused so much pain. Neighbors whispered, some refused to speak to Charles, and there were ugly incidents where Heinz was called names or told he didn't belong. But Charles was unmoved. He had made a promise to this child, not in words perhaps, but in actions, and he intended to keep it. He enrolled Heinz in school, taught him English with patience and persistence, and slowly integrated him into British life. It wasn't easy. Heinz struggled with the language, with the prejudice he encountered, and with his own trauma. He had nightmares about the bombings, about watching his mother die, about the months of hunger and fear. Charles sat with him during those nightmares, comforted him, and gradually the boy began to heal. The relationship between them deepened into something that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Charles became, in every meaningful sense, Heinz's father, and Heinz became his son. As months turned into years, Heinz flourished. He excelled in school, made friends, and became thoroughly British in many ways while still carrying the memories of his German childhood. Charles never hid Heinz's origins from him, never asked him to deny where he came from, but he gave him a new foundation, a new chance, a new family. The legal situation remained complicated for years. Officially, Hines was in Britain under false pretenses, and there was always the risk that authorities would discover the truth and deport him. Charles worked tirelessly with lawyers and sympathetic officials to regularize Hines's status, and eventually, in the early 1950s, Hines was officially granted permission to remain in Britain and was legally adopted by Charles. By then, the story had begun to leak out, and it attracted attention from newspapers and radio programs. Some celebrated Charles as a hero, a man who had seen past hatred to help a child in need. Others criticized him, arguing that he had broken laws, that he had shown favoritism to an enemy child when British orphans also needed help, that his actions set a dangerous precedent. Charles rarely responded to the criticism. When he did, his answer was always the same. He had seen a child who needed help, and he had helped him. It was that simple. He didn't consider himself a hero, didn't seek recognition or praise. He had simply done what his conscience demanded. Hines grew into a thoughtful, compassionate young man, deeply aware of the extraordinary gift he had been given. He often spoke about how easily his life could have gone differently, how he could have died on those streets in Freising, or languished in an orphanage, or been consumed by bitterness and trauma. Instead, because one man had chosen compassion over convention, he had been given a life, an education, a family, and a future. In interviews later in life, Hines described Charles as the most principled person he had ever known, a man who had risked everything for someone who society said wasn't worth saving. The broader implications of Charles's actions were profound. In the aftermath of the war, there was intense debate about how to treat German civilians, particularly children. Some argued for harsh measures, for collective punishment, for ensuring that Germans understood the consequences of their nation's actions. Others, like Charles, believed that children were innocent, that punishing them for the crimes of their parents' generation was both immoral and impractical. Charles's story became a quiet but powerful argument for the latter position. It demonstrated that compassion was possible even in the wake of terrible conflict, that seeing the humanity in others, even former enemies, was not weakness but strength. Charles Coward lived a long life, passing away in the 1980s, surrounded by family including Hines, who had by then married and had children of his own. At Charles's funeral, Hines delivered a eulogy that moved everyone present to tears. He spoke about being a terrified, starving child who had lost everything, about the moment when a foreign soldier had offered him bread instead of indifference, about the years of patience and love that had transformed his life. He said that Charles had taught him that nationality, language, and history mattered less than the choice to be kind, to help when help was needed, to see people as people rather than as categories or enemies. In the decades since, historians and ethicists have debated Charles Coward's actions. Some have raised legitimate questions about the legality of what he did, about the precedent it set, about whether individual soldiers should be making such decisions. But these academic debates often miss the human reality at the story's heart. A child's life was saved. A man chose compassion. A relationship formed that enriched both lives and rippled out to touch countless others. Hines went on to become an advocate for refugee children, working with organizations that helped displaced young people find safety and opportunity. He often said he was simply trying to pass on what had been given to him. The story of Charles Coward and Hines reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, individuals can make choices that affirm our better nature. Wars create categories, enemies and allies, us and them. But people, individuals with names and faces and stories, defy those categories. Charles saw past the category of enemy to the reality of a suffering child. He risked his career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom to act on that recognition. In doing so, he didn't just save one life. He demonstrated that the humanity we share is stronger than the divisions we create. Hines lived into his 80s, and before he died, he established a small foundation that helped reunite refugee children with surviving family members, or, when that wasn't possible, helped them find adoptive families willing to cross cultural and national boundary. To provide care. This story never became widely known, never made it into the major history books or documentaries about World War II. It remained a small, personal tale, shared among families and friends, occasionally surfacing in local newspapers or community gatherings. But in its smallness lies its power. Grand gestures and sweeping policies shape history, but individual acts of kindness shape lives. Charles Coward didn't end the war, didn't liberate a concentration camp, didn't change the course of battles. He simply saw a child and decided that child mattered. In a world that had decided millions of people didn't matter, that decision was revolutionary. As we look back on that era, we tend to focus on the great leaders, the massive battles, the political decisions that shaped nations. But history is also made by people like Charles Coward, people whose names appear in no monuments, but whose actions echo through generations. Every time someone chooses compassion over convenience, every time someone helps another person despite the risk or cost, every time someone sees past artificial divisions to recognize our shared humanity, they honor the legacy of people like Charles. They prove that the choice to be kind, to be decent, to refuse to let hatred have the final word is always available to us, no matter the circumstances. The British sergeant who adopted a German prisoner of war child teaches us that our common humanity doesn't vanish during conflict. It just becomes harder to see and harder to act upon. Charles Coward showed that it's possible to fight against evil without becoming consumed by hatred, to oppose a regime without despising its victims, and to win a war without losing your soul. His story is a reminder that we always have choices, even when circumstances seem to force our hand, even when rules and regulations and social pressure push us toward indifference. We can choose to see, to care, and to act. That choice, made by one man for one boy in the ruins of 1945, changed both their lives and offers us all a model for how to live with integrity in a complex world.